Getting crazy with the LJP whip pan. This is one of our Linen Jirsa kind of signature effects that we do on shoots. And it's really a cool and fun effect. And by the way, I'm sure there's a ton of other photographers that have done this too. We don't claim to have created this technique. Although I like the name that we came up with for it, whip pan, because it kind of reminds me of what we're doing with the shot. We're kind of whipping and panning the camera. So this is one of the coolest parts about really understanding lighting. Understanding lighting means that you can create images now in any scene. You can create whatever look, whatever you want to make, you can do, because now you understand and you've mastered lighting. That's the whole point of lighting 101, 201, 301, and 401, is to get you that point where literally you could be shooting in the middle of a parking lot and still create amazing images. That is no different than the whip pan. This is one of those just amazing images anywhere type techniques, at least anywhere at night. You can do this during the day too, but it's going to require much larger strobes, which we'll get to later on. But you might remember this technique if you watched Lighting 101. We use this technique a lot when we're on the dance floor. Now on the dance floor, we use it a little bit differently, where we're actually using on-camera flash, and we use that on-camera flash to directly flash our subject to freeze them while we slow down the shutter speed and create motion in the background, right? And for those types of shots, generally we're using rear curtain sync. This go around, it gets a little bit different. We're going to use first curtain sync, and I'm going to talk about why. But essentially the whole concept here is to take a scene that has something bright, some sort of lights in the background, and to add motion to that while freezing the subject. Now there's of course some tips, and this technique in general is kind of overall just a giant balancing act. And that's why we saved this for the last tutorial, because it is the most complex technique so far in this tutorial series. All right, so let me show you. We have the Sigma 35mm art, which I actually put on my camera for this tutorial. We ran the shutter speed at 1/5 of a second at f2.8 ISO 100 and 3600 Kelvin. And this is just handheld, so we're just slowing down the shutter, but I'm keeping it handheld just so you guys can see roughly what the background looks like and what our exposure looks like. This is that same shot now, but this time I'm adding a whip pan motion. So what do I do? Again, this goes back to, ideally with types of shots like this where we're doing panning motions, we want to hold the camera in a good way so that we kind of create the type of motion that we want to. So the best way to hold the camera is with the elbow tucked into the chest, like we did in Photography 101. Hand goes underneath the lens, and then basically you're going to control the motion. Like you can do any kind of a pan that you want. You can whip it left to right, you can go top bottom, you can add some kind of waves and motion into it, you can do a twist, you can do whatever you like, whatever motion you think is cool. But this one was created just by simply whipping from right to left or left to right. So it's a horizontal whip that goes across. Now, if you have a lens that has stabilization, you can get a slightly more kind of stable line. So just a straight line if you turn on stabilization. If you want a perfectly straight line and you don't have stabilization, then throw it onto like a panning tripod basically, okay? So just use the pan head and just pan on the tripod left and right as you take the shots. That's what I did here. So, what have we done this? Okay, so what does this look like now? Now we've taken this light and we've dragged it across and we get this really cool motion and effect. Now, what we have to do is add light to it to freeze. We have to pose and freeze our subject in the frame. This is where we get over to that balancing act. And let's start going through the process and tips, because you'll kind of understand what I mean as we go through it. So composition attributes, well, what are we thinking about here? Our main, the main component, the main compositional attribute for a whip pan is what? Slow shutter speed. Do you like how I waited for you to say that? I kind of waited just so you guys could think about it for a second. And hopefully I gave you enough time and you said slow shutter speed. That is the first compositional component. Okay, so we know that we're going to slow the shutter speed down, and generally a shutter speed from around 1/10 of a second to 1 second is good for a whip pan. And what really matters here is how far you want those trails to go and the overall brightness and exposure of the scene. The darker the scene, the slower you might need to go with your shutter speed, and you might need to raise up the ISO a little bit more as well. But the brighter the scene, the quicker you can go on your shutter speed. Again, for me, the ideal motion is created right around 1/5 to 1/4 of a second, okay? So that kind of, 1/5, that wasn't very, 1/5 to a half second is pretty ideal. Generally when it gets to 1 second, unless you're on a tripod or doing something, it gets a little bit too long, but that's just my own preference. But anywhere between 1/10 and 1 second is great for the length of your whip pan. Okay, so let's talk about sync speed for just a second. Now, We know, of course, that our sync speed is totally fine because we're less than 1/200th of a second. We're far less than 1/200th of a second. So we're not going to have an issue on that side. But do we want first curtain sync or rear curtain sync? And your first inkling, especially if you watched Lighting 101, you might think, oh, this is a moment where I need to flip rear curtain sync on. Remember that the only off-camera flashes that are going to offer rear curtain sync are ones that offer full feature capability. So you have full TTL capability, they will have rear curtain sync like the Phottix Metro system, or say, for example, on the larger side, you have like the ProPhoto B2 and B1 system with the Air TTL remote. But regardless, do we want first curtain sync or rear curtain sync? Well, let me just turn on my camera. I'm going to slow this down to 1 second. We're going to just use a 1 second shutter duration just for the sake of this demonstration here. Now, if I have first curtain sync turned on, the flash is going to fire now, and then it's not going to do anything at the end of the frame, right? And I add my motion. If I have my rear curtain sync turned on, the flash is going to wait, so I'm going to fire, and the flash fires just before this closes. So compositionally, what does that mean for us? If we have rear curtain sync turned on and we want to freeze the subject with the flash, then I need to move my camera into the correct place with the correct composition with the couple and everything at the end of the motion, right? So I would need to fire, there's the couple, and I leave it right there for the end of it. But if I use first curtain sync, I can place my composition where I want with the couple in the frame that I want. And then once it fires, I just add the motion to the shot afterwards. For this particular type of effect, for a whip pan, it's easier to use first curtain sync. Why? Because we can compositionally frame everything the way that we want it, and then we simply add the motion afterwards. We add the motion to whatever we need or do our twist, but we can compose the subject and everything in the frame where we want it, fire and that's frozen, and then add the motion afterwards. Just remember that whatever motion you want is going to be basically inverted. It's going to be backwards. Okay, you'll know this by just practicing it a couple times. But if we use rear curtain sync, it becomes very, very difficult to time that motion with the shutter speed correctly, where you land just in the right spot with the right composition for the couple at the very end of the frame. Okay, that becomes almost impossible. So for this particular shot, we use first curtain sync, which is a feature that actually every manual flash is going to by default fire first curtain sync. So you don't need to have a full feature flash for this effect. You only need a full feature flash when you want to do rear curtain sync. Okay, so here comes the balancing act. Ambient exposure is at f2.8 for your aperture, and then ISO 100 for this particular scene, right? So this is at f2.8 ISO 100, this is f2.8 ISO 100, f2.8 ISO 100, f2.8, this is at f2 and ISO 400 actually for this particular shot. So this must have been a much darker background. This is where the balancing act comes into play, because what we essentially need to do, we need our background to be just either the same brightness or a little bit darker than our subject, okay? The goal is that our subject, if the background is so bright, it'll basically end up pulling attention away from your subject, okay? So we want the background either the same brightness or a little bit darker than the subject, just to kind of bring attention into them. So we need to expose first, and generally what I'll do is I'll expose first to get the background the right level of brightness and to get the shutter speed to the right level of exposure and the right speed for my motion and the effect that I'm going to create. Then I go to my flash, and we get to balancing that flash with the ambient light. The problem is that if your flash power is too high, remember what we talked about earlier, we need a flash duration, not earlier, remember what we talked about in Lighting 101 with flash duration. When your flash is at full power, the flash duration is relatively slow. So the flash does not freeze the subjects like you might want. If we're whipping the camera back and forth and we want to have a sharp overall result and effect, we need a fast flash duration. Why? Because the longer that flash lasts on the person's face, the more it's going to show up in the effect as we pull across the image. So we can't really be firing those flashes at 1/1 power, because the flash duration at 1/1 power might be like 1/250th of a second. We need to get it down to 1/500th, 1/1000th of a second and below that. And so that means that we need to generally be around 1/4 of a second flash power and lower to get the best results from this effect. Otherwise, you're going to notice that your subject has streaking and that's due to the flash duration being too long. So that's where this balancing act comes into play, because we know that we can't power up the flash over 1/4 of a second, or sorry, 1/4 power. We know that we don't want the background to be too bright because it's going to overpower the subjects. So we want to make sure that we kind of balance that background, use the ISO to kind of balance everything, and then make sure that your ISO is at least high enough that you can also shoot at 1/4 flash power or lower, okay? So let's talk about real quick the light direction and quality, because you'll notice that there's kind of different setups with each of these shots. Typically for light direction and quality, we're doing bare bulb flashing, and we're placing it directly behind the subject. And basically, if you want to create this effect, right, where it's kind of like they're glowing and you see just an outline of their faces and so forth, the flash is directly behind their bodies. And what I like to do is aim it. If the guy's wearing a white shirt, you aim it into that white shirt and it blooms. So it's just behind the girl's shoulder and it's aiming into the white shirt and it's blooming up and it's lighting both their faces. And you get the reflection off of each other's faces, which is basically their skin lighting each other up. Okay? If you want a rim light, then you place it, for example, further behind the subject, bare bulb going directly into them. Okay, so that's about like 10, 15 feet behind the subject going directly at them to create that outline of their shape. Okay, if you want it somewhere in between, you can always place it somewhere in between. This is, I believe, like 5 feet behind the subject over here on this side. You can also use modifiers on the flash. One of my favorite modifiers for this type of effect is placing it close to the subject and using the Fangdong, using the Gary Fong light sphere or a light sphere of your choice on the flash, pointing it straight up and letting that dome bloom the effect out, and you get this beautiful kind of highlight behind them. So that's the light direction and placement behind them. Generally, we're doing this bare bulb, but you can also do it with a little bit of light modification. Use a Magmod, a Fangdong, whatever you want, whatever you've got, that's totally fine. So your test shot is basically going to reveal whether your ambient light balance to your flash exposure is correct and whether your shutter speed is decent for the type of motion that you're trying to create. This is what we mean by this is kind of the ultimate balancing act. This is why this entire course focuses on just one off-camera flash, because there's so much there to kind of master before we move into multi-light setups. Okay, with the light color and the white balance, well, for these types of shots, one of my favorite things to do is generally we are gelling, okay? Why? Because we have light backgrounds, or we have backgrounds that are running around 3000 to 3600 Kelvin at nighttime because you're using those nighttime lights. So I don't necessarily want the flash to be blue, although if that's one of the effects that you want to create, you can do that and it'll create that blue to kind of yellow contrast. What I like to do here is gel, and sometimes I'll double gel. So sometimes I'll use 2 CTO gels stacked over the front of the flash because it makes the light basically more warm or more yellow than the ambient light. So what we end up with is just this super warmth over them and then kind of a slightly less warmth around everything. So it kind of just, for me, it draws attention in kind of a cool way where we use color to draw attention into the subject. Okay, so generally we'll use double CTOs for some of these. I think almost all these are double. This is a single CTO. These are both double CTO gels. And then we're 1/8 to 1/4 power, 1/16 to 1/8. Why? Because the flash is right up against his chest here where it's pulled further away there. Over here, we're at f2 and ISO 400. We're using a 1-second shutter, and we have a tripod. So we're basically using the tripod and we're whipping it across with a slower motion, or just to get, not necessarily a slower motion, but we're whipping it across because there's less lights in the scene. And so we need more motion to be able to capture that, and we need a longer shutter speed to be able to catch that. So here we're firing at a 1/116 to 1/8 power. Why? Because we're at ISO 400. So remember how that's going to affect that. Okay? Once you get everything set up, once you got it all right, what we're going for with these shots, anytime you're backlighting, anytime you're rim lighting, anytime you're creating these silhouetted type effects, again, we're not lighting the face properly where you want them to look into the camera. So when we pose and we shoot these types of shots, we're posing them facing each other. We're dipping their heads and foreheads against each other, closing their eyes. We're having them look at each other. Generally, looking at each other, if you can see eyes, it might look a little bit weird, so just keep that in mind. We're having them go for kisses. We're keeping their profiles open so we can see their outlines of their shapes and so forth, and making this about them. If their eyes are open and they're looking at the camera, it's the easiest way to ruin the shot completely, because you're not properly lighting the face, and the first area of distraction is going to be the fact that there is not correct lighting on the face. So your pose in these types of shots is really everything, because we want to make sure that we're using a pose that's appropriate for the lighting effect that we're using. Okay, so we pose, we frame, we shoot. Whenever you're doing this kind of stuff, use different motions. So this is a tripod whip pan, so we have it on our MePhoto Globetrotter, and I'm just loosening the top head and just turning it. So I'm just spinning it back and forth and taking a few different shots. This is handheld, and all we're doing is twisting. We're twisting and moving the camera. And again, we have our Phottix Metro set up with the 2x CTO. And then this is, again, another tripod. So again, we're on our MePhoto, we're pulling it across the scene. Anytime you want these straight line streaks like this, you need to be on a tripod. Otherwise, unless you have image stabilization, there will be a little bit of waviness, a little bit of lines, kind of jaggedness to the lines. All right, so last thing, just when it comes to that light, just analyze it a little bit closely. Zoom in and take a look at it. With shots like this, for example, you might get it almost spot on. With this shot, I might go into Photoshop later on and just adjust the highlight on our chin. You might want to make sure that those highlights, those shadows are falling in the right places, or that if they are just a little bit off, that they're fixable in Photoshop. Sometimes to get it perfect, it might take too long. This is a 5-minute fix to just kind of clone some of that off there in Photoshop, but getting it right in the scene might take 20 minutes. So that's where you need to decide on the balancing act there between getting it right in camera versus what's a quick and easy fix in post. But either way, look at the shadows, look at the highlights with each one of these shots that you take, and just analyze closely. And last tip is try different motions. I love doing tons of different motions, different effects. You can zoom, you can twist, you can whip, you can do whatever you like with these types of effects. This is one of the funnest types of techniques to just getting wild, getting crazy, and getting amazing images out of it. And of course, imagine just showing these images to your client. They're gonna be like, what the heck? How did you just, this was literally in front of a parking lot. This was just in front of this area with like nothing there. And then this was in front of the actual building here with all sorts of people inside of it. And they were like, we want to get the Segerstrom, just to kind of know that we were there. And I'm like, well, there's all sorts of people inside of it. Let's do this. And for them, they know that they're still in front of the Segerstrom. These lights are still that building behind them. And so it still has that meaning there. But they had this really cool shot of it. And it's something that really made them happy. So go out and get crazy with the whip pan.